morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Today's topic is to give you an overview of the patient experience data workshop that was held at the agency on the 21st of September. And a bit the outline of my presentation would be to summarize a bit why this is important and where we are with this in the EU. And then go to discuss the key outcomes of the workshop, including a common understanding of patient experience data, methodologies, and then what challenges and actions were identified. Next slide, please. So it's obvious to all of us why patient experience data is important, and this has been touched upon already, so I won't go in detail too much, but for the agency, this is really key. We really need to ensure we have more patient-relevant outcomes, and there's no one in a better position than patients to obviously provide their own experience of treatment and condition and their disease. Next one, please. So regarding where we are with this in the EU, although there has been a lot of progress in recent years, the reality is that patient experience data are not systematically included in all aspects of medicine's development and regulation. And as it was discussed at the workshop, patient experience data are relevant throughout the whole life cycle of the medicine in the pre-authorization stage, but also later on in the post-authorization phase. So you're probably well aware that reinforcing the patient relevance in evidence generation is a key priority for EMA, and this has been reflected both in the network strategy, but also in the regulatory science strategy, which are recommending advancing standards for designing, conducting, analyzing, and reporting on relevant studies that allow to incorporate robust and meaningful patient experience data in regulatory submissions, and then to make sure how this data can inform regulatory decisions. Patient experience data is also relevant with the implementation of the new health technology assessment regulation, so in value assessments that obviously are relevant for subsequent decisions by payers. And as you are aware, there's guidance work ongoing at global level at ICH, and EMA is also involved in this work. So the workshop had 4 clear objectives to achieve a common understanding on what is understood. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, the first objective of the workshop was to achieve a common understanding on what we consider patient experience data in the EU. And I'll come to what was agreed in a minute. Also to reflect on the current methods for collecting and incorporating patient data into medicines development and also regulatory assessment. To reflect how direct patient data collection from a setting of real-world healthcare can be best used, and finally to identify priorities to enhance collection and use of such patient experience data. And the workshop was of a multi-stakeholder nature, so there were all types of stakeholders represented there: patients, consumers, healthcare professionals, but also academia, regulators, health technology bodies, and of course, industry. Next slide, please. So now I'll describe a little bit the key outcomes with regard to the common understanding, or what we understand in the EU as patient experience data. What we have discussed and also reflected in a workshop report that is now published on our website. Patient experience data are data collected via a variety of patient engagement activities and methodologies to collect patients' experience of their health status, symptoms, disease course, treatment preferences, quality of life, and impact of healthcare. And for EU regulators, the patient experience data includes patient-reported outcomes, which are outcomes reported directly by the patient without the interpretation of a clinician or another person. Also, patient preferences, which are referring to how acceptable is to patients a given treatment, a given alternative or choice among the outcomes of a given medicine. But also, patient engagement is part of patient experience data, and this would include feedback from patients achieved through interactions to gather their experience on disease, preference, outcomes, and treatments. Next slide, please. So what was discussed is that patient experience data in the EU does not only involve quantitative sources of evidence, but also qualitative that allow to gather a wider perspective of the patient experience. And an example here would be the outcome of a focus group, for example. Another interesting concept that was discussed is the idea of patient experience evidence. And here the definition that we propose is that patient experience evidence is data that has been qualified as valid scientific evidence after a scientific assessment. So both patient experience data and evidence would be relevant and also complementary concepts, and because patient data is needed to generate evidence, and of course both are needed to have meaningful outcomes for patients. Next slide, please. So the workshop, we discussed methodologies, and what was agreed as kind of highlights is that collection methods and analysis must be fit for purpose and produce reliable data. And the reality is that although we have both quantitative and qualitative methodologies for collecting and analyzing patient experience data, and this includes patient engagement methodologies, the reality is that more is needed. For example, on PROs, it was discussed that a robust methodology is needed to develop, validate, and evaluate PROs in study settings, both clinical trials or real-world data. PROs, it is important that they're sensitive to measure the effects of medicines, but at the same time, they have to be meaningful to patients. And also it was discussed that it's very important to define what is expected of the PRO data quality for inclusion in the SMPC. Because what has been seen is that there are cases where PROs are collected, but only a fraction of them have sufficient quality to then be included in the EU product information. On patient preferences, it was also discussed that studies have not been used too much to date in decision making, because these are complex studies to perform, they're time consuming, and also they involve a significant cost. So it's important that the foundational standards and the guidance are developed and ensure that patient preference studies can be integrated in decision making. So in general, on the patient preference area, it's important to have more discussions on methodology, guidance for requirements, and of course, global harmonization was also highlighted. And regarding guidance for patient preferences, one point that came clear from the workshop is that it's important that this guidance is developed based on practical experience, so that it's proportionate and not too rigid, because we are right now in an ongoing learning phase, and it's important that any guidance can allow to incorporate the outcomes of what's the current progress. So next slide, please. So now I'll go through the challenges that were identified and some actions that we're proposing to address these challenges. Well, one of the most obvious challenges highlighted by several stakeholders is that we need more alignment among decision makers. Industry associations presented a survey where they show that one of the reasons that developers or why developers are not including patient experience data in the data package is because there was a belief that EU regulators did not welcome this data, and the workshop was useful to clarify and provide a strong message that EU regulators do welcome, and we want patient experience data to be part of marketing authorizations. So it was important to make sure we're all connected and aligned in terms of requirements. And of course, they highlighted the value of EMA scientific advice and qualification of new methodologies. However, stakeholders raised that it would be good to also have additional engagement opportunities. For example, focus groups to discuss case studies were proposed, and EMA thinks that most of the challenges really can be addressed through multi-stakeholder cooperation and dialogue. Is very important to make sure that patients are involved early, and everyone agreed to continue this multi-stakeholder collaboration, and also see how we can develop additional engagement opportunities when we identify these key topics. Also, what's very important in terms of improving alignment is to take into account that patient experience data has to be useful for downstream decision makers, for example, downstream, health technology assessment. Next slide, please. Another challenge that was clearly mentioned by all stakeholders was the need for regulatory guidance on what are the criteria and the minimum requirements for patient experience data to make sure they're valid for regulatory decision making. And they asked for a Q&A or a position paper from the agency, and we've agreed that we will be working on a reflection paper to see how we can provide some advice on the best approach to generate and collect PED. So this should improve clarity on the current processes, on the current support mechanisms at EMA, while this guidance that I mentioned that is being developed at ICH level continues. So stakeholders really acknowledge the work that's going on harmonizing at ICH, but of course, they mentioned it would take some time to develop this guidance, and that's why we think by clarifying the EMA position in a reflection paper, then this should make it all more clear to all stakeholders. And other important aspects that were discussed here is that it's very important to maximize the support mechanisms that are currently available for developers at EMA. And this includes scientific advice, qualification of novel methodologies. Also, you're aware of the HTA parallel scientific advice and discussions at ITF level. And also what's important is to incorporate the learnings from the IMI Prefer project on patient preferences. Next slide, please. Another challenge was that stakeholders mentioned that it's important that the criteria for deciding whether PED, patient experience data, can be considered valid evidence for decision making are made clear and accessible in EMA in the EMA outcomes of the scientific assessment. So we acknowledge that there is really space to improve how we include this in the assessment report. And also stakeholders agreed that it's important to reflect on how we are reflecting patient experience data in the product information. It was also mentioned or agreed that for orphans, patient experience data is important for discussing significant benefit at time of reviewing the maintenance of the orphan designation. And that's something that can also be considered for the orphan maintenance assessment report. And finally, there were discussions on how to increase transparency using more modern channels. So that's something we'll look at. Next slide, please. Obviously, all stakeholders agreed that digital transformation is offering great opportunities for analysis and collection of patient experience data. For example, mobile devices really could allow real-time monitoring and also remote participation of patients. But obviously, this implies, for example, having novel endpoints which will need to be validated and also addressing all the uh, control and security of data. And there were some interesting innovative ideas discussed, like the personal data locker that was proposed by patient organizations. But this also highlight the challenge of making data interoperable. So what we're proposing as actions here is to integrate patient experience data with all the ongoing activities in the European health data space. And also this is part of the big data work plan that EMA has published. In particular, there is a recommendation number 3 on data discoverability that includes a review on how useful is e-health data. And this will be done by the end of next year. Next slide, please. And as you know, the project to build Darwin, this network of data, can also be very useful to capture and generate analysis of patient experience data. So that's something that we will be looking at, exploring how this could or Darwin could contribute to this analysis. And all the work on big data and patient experience data will be coordinated at EMA with involvement of patient representatives. Next slide, please. Another challenge was the need for resources and technical expertise, and here there's little to explain, but I think we all agree that we need to increase capacity, have adequate training, and also this will include training in areas relating to digital data, and this is already part of the big data work plan. Next slide, please. There were discussions also on the need for an overall strategy on patient experience data. And because there are challenges that remain in several areas, for example, on data interpretability, variability, how applicable results are, also ensuring that patients can understand well some of the methodologies, because it was highlighted that some are not always patient friendly. And it was highlighted at the workshop that's very important to establish clear responsibility and to have an overall strategy. So what was agreed here is to, again, insist on this aspect of collaboration and dialogue between stakeholders and always ensuring patients are involved earlier. EMA was acknowledged as an optimal facilitator for all these stakeholder discussions and progress in this area. And on the basis of what has been agreed at the workshop, EMA will also have discussions within the network on what is the current status, what are the next steps, and then how we can monitor that we are indeed progressing towards the goal that we set up. Next slide, please. So just briefly to finalize what we consider were the key messages from the workshop. Reinforcing patient relevance in evidence generation is a key priority for the EU medicines regulatory network. There is ongoing work at global level through ICH, which was acknowledged by everyone. And because this will take some time, it's very important that we continue our multi-stakeholder approach, discussing and trying to define these robust and meaningful methodologies for incorporating patient experience data in regulatory decision making. For this, EMA is going to work on a reflection paper to clarify what's the best EU approach to generate and collect such data. And because is really, really essential that ensure alignment between medicines development, regulatory decision making, but then downstream processes like HTA assessments is important to discuss with all stakeholders the methodology that is needed to capture and analyze the data, which is really what matters most to patients. Finally, the new digital tools for clinical data generation and possibly Darwin offer great opportunities to optimize data generation and then analysis when looking also into the future. So I'll stop here. Thanks so much. And I hope it was clear and happy to take questions. Thank you.